Hello, you're watching Mr.Spoocast. If you're listening to this late at night, do yourself a favor. Check that your door is locked and keep the lights low. In this video, I'm going to share 3 paranormal stories that start out ordinary, almost harmless, and slowly turn into something deeply unsettling. These aren't over-the-top campfire tales meant to shock you for a moment. Each story is grounded in real, familiar details: quiet apartment buildings, empty streets, unexpected messages, strange sounds, and that creeping feeling that someone is closer than they should be, even when you're sure you're alone. Get comfortable, put on your headphones, and if listening alone feels a little too intense, let this video play in the background so there's at least one voice in the room. Let's begin with the first story, The Christmas Eve I'll Never Forget. Introduction. I've told myself a lot of stories over the years about why I never liked Christmas after that winter. I blamed the noise, the expectation, the way everyone seems determined to feel something on command. I blamed the commercials. I blamed the lights that make streets look too clean and too bright, like someone is trying to erase whatever usually hides in the corners. Those explanations were comfortable because they were ordinary. They let me smile and shrug when people asked why I always found a reason to disappear in late December. The truth is simpler, and it's worse. There was one Christmas Eve that didn't end. It's still lodged in my body the way a splinter stays in the skin, even after you think you've pulled it out. Sometimes I'll be in a grocery store in late December, and I'll catch the smell of oranges and cinnamon from some display, and my hands will go damp. My chest will tighten as if something is pressing from the inside. It isn't nostalgia. It's a warning my nervous system learned the hard way. I haven't written any of this down before, partly because it sounds like the kind of thing people retell in whispers for attention, and partly because I didn't want to give it shape. If it stayed unspoken, it could remain a cluster of sensations, sound, pressure, a certain kind of silence, without turning into a story that someone could argue with. But I'm older now, and I've realized that keeping it sealed hasn't made it smaller. It only made it solitary. I need to set it out in the open exactly as it happened, with the same slow dread that settled into me that night. This happened on Christmas Eve, the one where everything looked like it was supposed to. The day had been mild for December, the kind of damp cold that makes your clothes feel heavier when you step outside. The sky was the flat, pale gray you get in northern Italian winters, as if someone had spread a sheet over the city. I remember that because it made the holiday decorations feel especially artificial. Strings of lights hung over the street like a promise, but the air smelled of wet stone, exhaust, and the faint sweetness of roasted chestnuts from a cart down the block. I was 26 then, newly independent in the way people mean when they're proud of you for paying rent and cooking pasta without burning it. I lived alone in a small apartment on the 3rd floor of a building that had been standing longer than my grandparents had been alive. The stairwell always smelled of old plaster and someone else's detergent. In the summer, it baked. In the winter, it held cold like a cellar. If you listened closely, you could hear the building working, pipes ticking, a distant thump of someone's footsteps, the elevator cable singing faintly when it moved. My apartment was the kind of place you accept when you're starting out. Narrow rooms, one window facing the street, another facing the back courtyard. The radiator in the bedroom clicked in a way that sounded like a polite cough. The kitchen tiles were cracked in 2 places, and there was a spot by the sink where the grout had darkened no matter how much I scrubbed. None of it bothered me. I liked the predictability. I liked that nothing in my life felt dramatic. I had a job I could describe without hesitation, friends I saw on weekends, routines that made the days feel manageable. I was supposed to be with family that night. My mother had asked me to come down to Rome for 3 days. She had been asking since the beginning of December, leaving small pauses in the conversation where she expected me to agree. I had made excuses that sounded reasonable: deadlines, travel costs, the train schedule. The real reason was less practical. I'd spent the last few months feeling like my life had been wrapped too tightly, like something in me was being compressed. Work had been relentless. My sleep had been thin and broken. I'd started waking up with my jaw clenched, teeth aching as if I'd been biting down on something in my dreams. I didn't want to sit at a table with relatives and pretend I was fine. I didn't want questions. I didn't want to perform warmth. So I told myself I needed a quiet Christmas Eve. I told myself I'd cook something simple, watch something mindless, and go to bed early. I wanted the holiday to slide past me without leaving a mark. I wanted a night that was nothing. By late afternoon, the city had started to drain. Shops closed earlier than usual. People moved with that specific distracted urgency of someone holding a fragile schedule in their hands. The sound on the street changed. Less traffic, fewer voices, more echo. When I walked to the supermarket for last-minute groceries, my footsteps seemed louder than they should have. The air was cold enough to make my eyes water. I remember the sensation of my scarf damp against my throat, and the way the plastic handles of the grocery bag cut into my fingers as I walked back. Back in the building, the stairwell lights were on a timer, so they would flick off halfway up the second flight unless you waved your hand to trigger the motion sensor. It annoyed me in a small way that night. I had to pause, juggling the bags, to make the light wake up again. The sudden brightness made the stairwell's shadowed corners jump out, then fade back. It was nothing. It was always like that. But I remember thinking, briefly and inexplicably, that I didn't like being forced to stop in the middle of a dark stairwell when the building felt empty. When I reached my floor, I noticed a smell that didn't belong, something smoky, like incense or burnt paper. It was faint, and it could have been coming from any of the apartments. Someone might have been cooking too long. Someone might have lit a candle. I stood for a moment with the key in my hand, listening. The building was unusually quiet. I didn't hear a television. I didn't hear laughter. Most of the neighbors were older, and a lot of them went away for the holidays. It was possible I was one of the only people still in the building. I let myself in, locked the door behind me, and did the small rituals that made my apartment feel safe. Turning on the kitchen light, setting the bags on the counter, checking the window latches. The street outside was already dimming. The holiday lights across the road blinked in a slow rhythm. From my window, I could see a shop that sold bedding and curtains. Someone had draped fake snow along the display, and it looked dusty even from a distance. I tried to make the evening ordinary. I cooked, ate, cleaned. I played music low, the kind of background sound that fills in the silence without demanding attention. Every so often, I glanced at my phone. Messages came in from colleagues wishing me Buon Natale with emojis and exclamation points. My mother called once. I let it ring out. I told myself I'd call her later when I was calmer, when I could pretend the distance was about logistics and not about something tight inside me. At around 8, I noticed that the light in the courtyard window looked different. Usually, there was a dim yellow from the few apartments facing the courtyard, and the occasional glow of someone's television. That night it looked emptier, darker. The courtyard itself was a rectangle of stone and metal railings with a couple of bare trees and a single trash bin. In the daytime, it was unremarkable. At night, it was just a void between buildings. I pulled the curtain back and watched for a minute, expecting to see at least one neighbor moving around, a flicker of life. Nothing moved. The air in the courtyard looked thick, as if the cold had weight. I realized I was holding my breath. I let the curtain fall and told myself not to be ridiculous. It was Christmas Eve. The city was quiet. That was the whole point. I turned on the television, not because I wanted to watch it, but because the voices made the apartment feel inhabited. The program was some holiday special, bright and loud. I kept it on low and sat on the edge of the couch with a blanket over my legs. The radiator clicked behind me. Every click made my shoulders shift, as if my body was bracing for something that didn't arrive. At some point, while I was staring at the screen without absorbing it, I heard a sound that didn't fit the rest. It was subtle enough that at first I thought it was part of the show. A soft tap followed by a pause, then another. Not rhythmic like a dripping faucet, not random like a pipe, but measured. I muted the television and listened. Silence. Then the tap again. It came from inside the apartment, not outside. I stood up slowly. The floorboards creaked under my weight. I waited, trying to place it. The radiator clicked once more, and I almost laughed at myself. Old buildings make noise. That's what they do. But the tap came again, and this time I recognized the direction, the front door. It wasn't a knock in the usual sense. It was too light for that, as if someone were touching the door with the tip of a fingernail. Tap. Pause.
Tap.
The kind of sound you might make if you were testing whether someone was asleep without wanting to wake the whole building. I didn't move at first. The skin on my forearms tightened. My mouth went dry. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, not pounding, just present, as if it had stepped forward to be counted. I checked the time on my phone. 20:47. I remember the exact numbers because it felt important that it was still early, still within the normal part of the evening. It wasn't midnight. It wasn't a witching hour. It was a time when people might still be out, when a neighbor might need something. I tried to cling to that. The tapping stopped. I stood there in the middle of the living room, halfway between the couch and the hallway, waiting for the next sound. The apartment felt suddenly delicate, like a shell. The television's black screen reflected my own face in a distorted way. Outside, the streetlights had come on, casting a pale orange glow that didn't reach into the corners of my room. After a full minute with no sound, I told myself it had been the building. Maybe a pipe expanding. Maybe the door settling. I unmuted the television and forced myself to sit back down. The tapping started again almost immediately, but not in the same place. This time it was from the courtyard window in the bedroom. I knew because I felt it more than I heard it. A faint vibration through the wall, like someone touching glass. I turned off the television. The apartment went quiet in a way that made my ears ache. I walked down the hall to the bedroom. The door frame felt colder than the rest of the wall when I brushed past it. I stopped in the doorway and stared at the window. The curtain was drawn, but not perfectly. A thin vertical gap showed the dark courtyard beyond. The tapping came again, soft against the glass, right where the gap was. It was so precise that my stomach turned. Whoever, or whatever, was making it was close enough to reach my third-floor window. I stepped forward and pulled the curtain closed completely. The tapping stopped. I stood there, one hand still on the fabric, feeling the thud of blood in my fingertips. My thoughts skittered for explanations. A bird. A branch. Wind. But the courtyard trees were bare, and there was no wind I could hear. And birds don't tap like that. Patient, deliberate, as if they know there's a person on the other side. I didn't open the curtain again. I didn't look. I backed away from the window, turned on the bedroom light, and went back into the hallway. The light made everything look more normal, but it also made me feel exposed, as if I had lit myself up for someone else's benefit. I checked the front door, pressing my palm against it. Cold wood, solid. The lock was set. I looked through the peephole. The corridor outside was empty, the yellow ceiling light humming faintly. No shadow under the door across the hall. No movement. Just the stillness of a building that had gone to sleep. That should have calmed me. Instead, it made the sensation sharper. If no one was there, then what had tapped? I returned to the living room and sat again, but I didn't turn the television back on. I listened. The building made its usual noises. Radiator clicks, a distant pipe, something shifting like a sigh. Every ordinary sound seemed to step forward and offer itself as an explanation, and none of them fit. I kept thinking about the tapping against the window. I kept picturing the courtyard's metal railings, slick with moisture, and someone real, standing on something to reach my glass. A ladder. A chair. Someone with hands and intent. The thought made my throat tighten. I told myself I was overreacting. I told myself I was tired. I got up to make tea, anything to give my hands a task. While the kettle heated, I noticed that the smoky smell from earlier had returned, stronger now. It seemed to seep from the hallway, not the kitchen. I leaned out and inhaled. It was like paper that had been held over a flame, not fully burned, just singed. It carried a faint sweetness underneath, like old perfume. I stood there listening. Somewhere below, a door closed softly. The sound traveled up the stairwell, muffled by layers of plaster. It was the kind of sound you would normally ignore. That night it felt like a signal. I took my tea back to the couch and sat with the mug warming my palms. I watched the street through the window. A couple passed by, their faces turned toward each other, shoulders hunched against the cold. A car went through the intersection slowly, tires hissing on wet asphalt. A man in a Santa hat staggered slightly as he walked, laughing into his phone. Normal life, skimming past the surface. And yet, inside my apartment, the air felt different, thicker, as if the rooms were waiting. The next tap came at 21:13, and this time it was neither the door nor the bedroom window. It was the living room window, the one facing the street. A gentle, firm touch on the glass, close enough that it sounded like it was right beside my ear. I didn't stand up right away. My body froze in a way I've only felt a few times in my life, when instinct overrides thought. The mug in my hands trembled slightly, making the tea ripple. I stared at the curtain, at the faint outline of the window frame behind it, and I knew with a strange certainty that if I pulled it back, I would see someone looking in. I didn't move. I waited, telling myself that if it was a branch or a decoration, it would tap again in the same mindless way. If it was a person, they might stop if they realized I wasn't going to respond. The tapping didn't repeat. Instead, something slid along the glass, a slow, almost tender scrape, as if a fingertip were tracing the edge of the pane. The sound was so quiet that it could have been imagined, except that it made the hairs on my arms lift. I set the mug down carefully on the coffee table, as if any sudden movement might draw attention. My feet found the floor. I stepped toward the window, stopping a meter away. The curtain barely moved with my breath. The scrape stopped. Silence settled again, heavier than before. The kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, but occupied. That was the moment I understood something I had refused to acknowledge up until then. Whatever was happening wasn't going to resolve itself if I ignored it. It wasn't a one-off noise. It was a pattern, and I was part of it. I didn't know that this was only the beginning of the night. I didn't know how quickly the sense of unease would turn into something physical and immediate, something that would make the holiday decorations outside look like a cruel joke. At that point, all I knew was that someone, or something, had found me on a night when most people were surrounded by family, and I was alone in a building that suddenly felt like it had too many hidden spaces. I stood there, listening to my own breathing, and waited for the next sound. Background. To understand why that night unraveled me the way it did, I have to explain how ordinary my life was leading up to it, and how much I depended on that ordinariness. I wasn't someone who chased thrills or lingered on dark thoughts. I didn't consume horror stories or go looking for explanations in the paranormal. If anything, I leaned in the opposite direction. I liked explanations that fit neatly into place. I liked routines because they made the world feel predictable, and predictability felt like safety. I had moved into that apartment a little over a year earlier. Before that, I'd shared places with roommates, always negotiating noise, space, habits. Living alone felt like a reward. The first weeks had been almost euphoric. I could leave a book open on the table and find it exactly where I left it. I could wake up in the middle of the night and not have to parse unfamiliar sounds. Every creak belonged to the building, not to another person's movement. Over time, I learned the apartment's language. I knew when the radiator would click before it did. I knew which floorboard near the bathroom door complained if you stepped on it too fast. I knew the rhythm of the elevator, how long it took to arrive, the soft jolt when it stopped. The building itself had a presence, but it was a passive one. It had seen decades of tenants come and go. Old names were still etched into some of the mailboxes, the metal worn smooth by hands that no longer lived there. The ground floor held a small tailor shop that was rarely open, and an office for a building manager who appeared only when something broke badly enough. Most of the residents were elderly couples or single people who kept to themselves. We nodded in the stairwell, exchanged brief greetings, but rarely lingered. It was the kind of anonymity that feels neutral until you realize how complete it is. My routine was simple. I woke early, took the same route to work, passed the same bakery where the owner always smoked just outside the door before opening. Evenings were quiet. I cooked, read, scrolled through my phone. On weekends, I met friends or visited my parents when work allowed. Nothing in my life felt unstable. Even when I was tired, even when I felt that pressure in my jaw when I woke up, I told myself it was temporary. Stress had explanations. Fatigue had causes. There was nothing lurking beneath the surface, nothing waiting. In the weeks leading up to Christmas, the city had shifted in subtle ways. Decorations went up. then came down again as storms knocked them loose. The pace changed. People became either frantic or strangely gentle, as if trying to outrun or soften the same invisible deadline. I noticed these things in passing, filed them away without much thought. The only irregularity I remember clearly was a series of small, almost forgettable moments that only gained weight in hindsight. One evening, about 10 days before Christmas Eve, I came home later than usual. The stairwell light on the first floor was out, so I climbed in semi-darkness until the second-floor sensor kicked in. As I reached my floor, I thought I heard movement above me. Slow, careful steps, as if someone were descending but stopping whenever I paused. I remember turning, looking up the stairs, seeing nothing. The sound stopped immediately. I stood there longer than necessary, listening, before telling myself it was my imagination and unlocking my door. Another time, I found a flyer slipped halfway under my door. It advertised a Christmas concert at a nearby church, printed on cheap paper. What struck me wasn't the flyer itself, but the way it had been placed. Not pushed fully under, not left neatly in front, but inserted just enough that I would notice it when I came home. It felt intentional, as if someone had wanted to be sure I saw it, but hadn't wanted to be seen. I picked it up, glanced at it, and threw it away without thinking much about it. People leave flyers. That's normal. There was also the smell, that faint, smoky, sweet scent that appeared occasionally in the hallway. It never lasted long. I mentioned it once to a neighbor I ran into by the mailboxes, a woman with carefully styled gray hair and a perpetually impatient expression. She wrinkled her nose and said she hadn't noticed anything. Maybe someone was burning food, she suggested, already turning away. Her dismissal felt final. I let the matter drop. Looking back, none of these things would have raised alarm on their own. They were the kinds of details you forget as soon as something more immediate demands your attention. I had deadlines. I had errands. I had my own internal noise. The building faded into the background of my life, a static presence that required nothing from me. On Christmas Eve itself, the sense of isolation was more pronounced than usual, but again, it had an explanation. People had left. Doors were shut. Families gathered elsewhere. I told myself I had chosen this, that the quiet was exactly what I wanted. Even when the first tapping sounds unsettled me, part of me clung to the idea that there was a rational cause I simply hadn't identified yet. That clinging was important. It was the last line of defense between discomfort and fear. There's another detail I need to mention, something I hadn't connected to the night until much later. About a week before Christmas, I'd noticed that the lock on the building's main entrance didn't always catch properly. Sometimes you had to pull the door hard to make it latch. I'd made a mental note to be careful, to ensure it was closed behind me. I don't know if others were as diligent. I don't know how often it stood slightly ajar, offering quiet access to anyone who pushed. I also realized, only after everything happened, that I had become predictable without meaning to. I left for work at the same time every morning. I returned at roughly the same hour each evening. I took my trash out on the same days. My lights followed a pattern. From the street, from the courtyard, from anywhere with a view, my life would have been easy to map. That thought unsettles me now in a way it didn't then. That Christmas Eve, before the tapping began, before the smells returned and the silence grew heavy, I was still operating under the assumption that the world was fundamentally indifferent to me. I believed I could move through it unnoticed, unobserved, just another person in a city full of them. The idea that someone might be paying attention, that my presence in that apartment on that specific night could matter to anyone else, had never seriously crossed my mind. That belief is fragile. I learned that once it breaks, it doesn't reform easily. You can't unlearn the sensation of being seen when you thought you were alone. As I stood in my living room, listening to the quiet press in from all sides, all of that context was invisible to me. I wasn't thinking about patterns or access points or subtle warnings. I was thinking about the next sound, the next tap, the next proof that what I was experiencing wasn't just a misfiring imagination. The background of my life, the routines, the predictability, the quiet confidence that nothing truly strange happened to people like me, was about to be tested in a way I had no framework for. And when it failed completely. First, irregularities. After the scrape against the living room window stopped, I stayed exactly where I was for what felt like an unreasonable amount of time. My body had settled into a rigid stillness that didn't feel like a decision. It felt imposed, as if movement had been quietly revoked. My breathing was shallow, careful, the way it gets when you're trying not to be heard by something you don't fully understand yet. Nothing happened. No more taps. No footsteps in the stairwell. No voices outside. The silence stretched, thinning my initial spike of fear into something more corrosive. Anticipation. It's one thing to react to a sudden noise. It's another to wait, knowing something has already announced itself and may do so again on its own terms. Eventually, the tension in my legs became uncomfortable enough to force action. I moved slowly, deliberately, as if the air itself might resist me. I picked up the remote and turned the television back on, but kept the volume barely above mute. The flickering light felt like a compromise, enough movement to break the stillness, not enough noise to draw attention. The images washed over the walls, making shadows shift in ways that kept tugging at the edges of my vision. I sat, watched, listened. Every minute that passed without incident made me feel both safer and more exposed. Safe because nothing was happening. Exposed because nothing was happening yet. The first real irregularity after that came from a place I didn't expect. My phone. At 21:29, it vibrated softly against the couch cushion. The sound made me flinch harder than the tapping had. I picked it up immediately, my thumb already poised to unlock it, then hesitated. The screen lit up with a notification preview. Unknown number. There was no message preview, just the indication that something had come through. A text. I stared at it, trying to summon a reasonable explanation. Wrong number. Automated spam. A holiday greeting sent en masse. My phone number wasn't private. It existed in the world. This meant nothing. I unlocked the screen. The message contained no words, just a single image. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust, for my brain to accept what it was seeing. The photo was dark, grainy, taken in low light. It showed a narrow rectangle of illumination cutting through darkness, bordered by familiar shapes. My heart began to beat faster as recognition crept in. It was my living room window. The angle was wrong for it to be taken from inside. The perspective was slightly elevated, tilted downward. The faint reflection of my television screen was visible in the glass. One of the holiday lights from across the street bled into the frame as a blurred streak. The photo had been taken from outside. For a few seconds I couldn't move. The room seemed to pull away from me, as if I were suddenly very far from my own body. My fingers went numb around the phone. I scrolled up, down, as if expecting more context to appear. There was nothing else. No caption. No timestamp beyond now. I stood up so abruptly that the couch creaked loudly beneath me. The sound echoed in the apartment and I froze again, listening for any response. None came. I moved to the window, stopping short of touching the curtain. Every instinct screamed not to pull it back, not to confirm what I already knew. My phone vibrated again. Another image. This one was closer. The frame was filled with glass and darkness beyond it, and in the reflection, faint but unmistakable, I could see movement. A shape near the curtain. My own silhouette. The realization hit me with physical force. Whoever was sending these messages was still outside. Close enough to see me move. Close enough to take another photo seconds after the first. I backed away from the window, my heels bumping into the coffee table. My breathing became shallow and fast, the air catching in my throat. I locked the phone screen without responding, without thinking, as if silence might protect me. I moved through the apartment, checking locks again, this time with shaking hands. The front door, the bedroom window, the bathroom window that faced a narrow air shaft. Everything was closed, secured. It didn't help. The knowledge that someone could stand outside my living room window and watch me made the boundaries of the apartment feel theoretical, flimsy. The phone vibrated again. I didn't look right away. I set it face down on the counter, as if denying it visibility would deny it power. My ears strained for any sound from outside, footsteps on metal, the scrape of shoes against stone, breathing that wasn't my own. I heard nothing. After what felt like several minutes, I forced myself to turn the phone over. This time, it wasn't an image. It was text. Merry Christmas. No punctuation. No emoji. Just the words. My stomach twisted violently. The phrase, so ordinary, so harmless in any other context, felt invasive. Intimate. It meant they knew what night it was. It meant this wasn't random. It meant I was part of something intentional. I typed, then erased, then typed again before finally stopping myself. Responding felt dangerous. Engaging felt like acknowledging a connection I didn't want to exist. I locked the screen again and set the phone down with more force than necessary. That was when I heard the sound from the hallway, not the stairwell, not the apartment above or below. The hallway directly outside my front door. A soft, dragging noise like fabric brushing against the wall. It moved slowly, pausing intermittently, as if whoever was making it was listening for a reaction. I stood in the kitchen, every muscle taut, staring at the closed door. The smell of smoke and sweetness was stronger now, unmistakable, seeping in through the cracks around the frame. The dragging stopped directly in front of my apartment. I could see the shadow beneath the door shift slightly, blocking the weak light from the corridor. Someone was standing there, very still. I didn't approach the door. I didn't speak. I barely breathed. The thought of looking through the peephole filled me with a deep, visceral dread. If I looked, they would know. If I looked, the last illusion of separation would disappear. My phone vibrated once more, sharp and insistent in the quiet. I didn't need to check it to know it was them. The shadow remained unmoving. The smell lingered. The hallway light hummed faintly through the door. The sense of being enclosed, surrounded, settled over me like weight. This was no longer a series of strange noises or misinterpreted signals. This was contact. Deliberate, sustained, escalating. And it was only just beginning. Barf, escalating tension. I don't remember deciding to move. My body shifted on its own, guiding me away from the front door and deeper into the apartment, as if distance, even symbolic distance, might help. I ended up standing in the narrow space between the kitchen and the hallway, where I could see the bedroom door, the bathroom door, and the sliver of the living room all at once. It felt like the most defensible position, though I couldn't have explained why. The shadow under the door didn't move. I watched it for so long that my eyes began to ache. The mind does strange things when it's deprived of information. The darkness beneath the door seemed to pulse, expanding and contracting with my breathing. I had to keep blinking to remind myself that it was just a shadow, just an absence of light. The smell grew stronger. It was definitely smoke now, layered with something old and cloying, like dried flowers left too long in a drawer. It caught in the back of my throat and made my eyes sting. I pressed my lips together, afraid that if I opened my mouth I might cough, and the sound would carry. My phone vibrated again. This time the sound felt unbearable, too loud for the fragile quiet of the apartment. I snatched it up, my hands slick with sweat, and glanced at the screen before I could stop myself. Another photo. It took me a moment to understand what I was seeing, because my brain resisted the implication. The image showed my front door from the outside. The angle was low, tilted slightly upward, as if the phone had been held near someone's chest. The wood grain was unmistakable. The small scratch near the handle, the one I'd noticed when I first moved in, was clearly visible. In the frame, occupying the lower half of the image, was a dark shape that could only be a foot. A shoe, close enough to the door that it almost touched it. I felt a surge of nausea so strong that my knees weakened. I leaned against the counter to steady myself. The timestamp read, now. They were still there. Right outside. Another message followed almost immediately. I can hear you breathing. I clapped a hand over my mouth, horror blooming cold and sharp in my chest. I hadn't realized how loud my own breath had been, how the thinness of the apartment's walls might betray me. The idea that they were attuned to such a small, intimate sound made my skin crawl. It wasn't just observation. It was attention. The shadow under the door shifted slightly, as if confirming the message. Not stepping away, just adjusting weight. I retreated another step, then another, until my back brushed the bedroom door. I turned the handle slowly and slipped inside, closing it behind me with infinite care. The bedroom felt different immediately, smaller, more enclosed. The air was cooler. The single window loomed, its curtain a solid barrier between me and the courtyard. I locked the bedroom door, though the lock was flimsy and symbolic at best. The click sounded obscenely loud in my ears. I stood there listening for a reaction from the hallway. None came. My phone vibrated again, a soft, patient buzz. This time I didn't look. I slid down until I was sitting on the edge of the bed, my back against the wall. My heart hammered so hard that I felt it in my throat, in my wrists, in the soles of my feet. Each beat seemed to announce my presence, my aliveness, to anyone who might be listening. The tapping started again. Not on the front door, not on the living room window, on the bedroom window. It was gentler than before, almost polite. Tap. Pause. Tap. Exactly where the glass met the frame, where the curtain brushed lightly against it. The sound was intimate in a way that made my stomach twist. This wasn't someone trying to get in. It was someone reminding me they were there. I stared at the curtain, my eyes tracing the faint outline of the window behind it. I told myself not to look, not to move. I pressed my palms against my thighs, grounding myself in the feel of fabric, of muscle, of something solid and real. The tapping stopped. I waited. Seconds stretched, each one taut and vibrating. My phone buzzed again, insistent now, like a pulse. Against every instinct, I looked. The image was different this time. It showed the courtyard from above, taken from an angle that made my stomach lurch. It wasn't from my window. It was from above my window looking down. The stone floor, damp and dark, filled most of the frame. At the edge, barely visible, was the top of my bedroom window, the curtain inside glowing faintly from the light I'd left on. They were higher than I thought. On the railing. On the ledge. Somewhere they should not have been able to stand comfortably. The message that followed was longer than the others. You should turn off the light. It makes it hard for you to see me. My chest tightened painfully. The suggestion embedded in that sentence was worse than any direct threat. They weren't outside in the dark while I hid inside the light. They were positioned, watching, controlling the terms of visibility. The idea that they could be close enough to my window, elevated enough to take that photo, without making a sound I could hear, made my skin prickle with cold. I reached for the lamp beside the bed, my fingers hovering over the switch. Turning it off felt like surrender. Leaving it on felt like exposure. There was no right choice, only different kinds of vulnerability. Before I could decide, the light went out on its own. The room plunged into darkness so complete that for a moment I thought I'd gone blind. My breath caught in my throat. The hum of electricity vanished. Somewhere in the apartment, the television cut off abruptly. The radiator clicked once, then fell silent. The power was out. I froze, my hand still hovering uselessly in the air. The sudden absence of sound was disorienting. No appliances. No lights. No ambient city noise filtering through the walls. It was as if the building itself had stopped breathing. In the darkness, the tapping resumed, louder now, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. No pause. I scrambled off the bed, my hands searching blindly for the wall, for the window, for anything familiar. My foot caught on the edge of the rug and I stumbled, barely catching myself before hitting the floor. The noise seemed enormous in the quiet. The tapping stopped instantly. I stood there, bent slightly forward, waiting for the response I was sure would come. My ears strained so hard they hurt. In the silence, I could hear something else now. Something subtle but unmistakable. Breathing. Not mine. It was close. Too close to be in the courtyard below. It sounded like it was just beyond the glass, measured and controlled, as if whoever it belonged to was trying to stay calm. My phone vibrated again, a pale rectangle of light in my hand. The sudden illumination made me gasp. The message was short. Don't be scared. The breathing continued, soft and steady, separated from me by nothing but glass and a curtain I hadn't dared to move. In that moment, the reality of my situation crystallized with horrifying clarity. This wasn't a prank. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't going to end with an apology or an explanation. Someone had orchestrated this. My isolation, the timing, the darkness. They knew the building. They knew my apartment. They knew me well enough to know I was alone. And they were enjoying the control. I stood there in the dark, my phone glowing uselessly in my hand, the sound of another person's breath threading through the silence, and I understood that whatever came next would not be something I could simply endure. I would have to act or be acted upon. Critical incident. The breathing stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The silence that followed was not relief. It was sharper, more dangerous. My body reacted before my thoughts did, muscles tightening as if bracing for impact. I realized I was holding my phone so tightly my fingers ached. The screen had dimmed, but it was still the only source of light in the room, casting weak illumination across the bed, the wall, the closed door. Then came a sound I will never forget. A soft metallic click. It came from inside the apartment. Not from the window. Not from outside. From the hallway. For a split second, my mind refused to process it. I replayed the sound internally, trying to fit it into something harmless. A pipe. A distant elevator. But I knew the sound of the building. This was precise. Mechanical. Familiar in the worst possible way. The sound of a lock being tested. My stomach dropped so violently it felt like my organs shifted. I turned slowly toward the bedroom door, every movement exaggerated by fear. The darkness beyond the thin line beneath the door seemed deeper than the rest of the room, as if it swallowed what little light escaped from my phone. Another click, this time closer. The bedroom door handle moved. Not fully, just enough to test resistance. A careful, exploratory motion. Whoever was on the other side was not panicking. They were not rushing. They were confirming something they already expected to be true, that the door was locked. A low exhale escaped me before I could stop it. The sound felt obscene, like a confession. Immediately, the handle stopped moving. The pause that followed was deliberate, weighted with awareness. They knew exactly where I was. My phone vibrated. I didn't look. I couldn't. My eyes were fixed on the door, on the slight indentation where the handle met the wood. The air felt thin, insufficient. I realized I was crouching slightly, my shoulders hunched, as if trying to make myself smaller. The handle moved again, this time harder. The door shuddered just once. Not a slam, not an attempt to break it down. A test, a demonstration. The flimsy lock rattled, protesting weakly, then held. I pressed my hand against my mouth to keep from making a sound. My heart was pounding so violently I was certain it could be heard through the walls. Each beat felt like it might give me away. The pressure on the handle released. Footsteps retreated, slow and unhurried, back into the hallway. I stayed frozen, my body vibrating with adrenaline. Seconds passed. Then a minute. Then another. I didn't move. I didn't breathe properly. I listened until my ears ached. Nothing. The absence of sound was unbearable. Then my phone vibrated again. I looked. The message contained no image this time. You lock doors like someone who expects to be alone. Tears blurred my vision, not from sadness, but from the sheer overload of terror. That sentence wasn't a threat. It was an observation. It meant they had been inside my apartment long enough to know my habits. Long enough to watch me move through my space when I thought no one else was there. My gaze dropped to the floor. The thin strip of darkness beneath the bedroom door shifted. Light appeared. A narrow beam moving slowly across the hallway floor. A flashlight. The beam stopped directly in front of my door. It lingered there, illuminating the crack beneath it, flooding the bedroom with a thin, accusing line of light. Whoever held it knew exactly what they were doing. They were giving me something to see while denying me the rest. The beam moved upward. It traced the outline of the door, unhurried. The handle. The lock. The place where my face would be if I stood too close. I backed away until my calves hit the bed frame. I climbed onto the mattress, pressing myself into the corner farthest from the door, as if elevation might help, as if distance within the same small room meant anything at all. The flashlight turned off. Total darkness returned. Then the sound came. Not footsteps. Not tapping. Scraping. Metal against wood. Slow. Deliberate. Repetitive. They were using something against the lock. A tool. A key. Something thin enough to probe, to pry. The lock rattled violently now, the cheap mechanism whining in protest. Each movement sent a jolt of panic through my body. I clutched my phone, my thumb hovering uselessly over the emergency call screen. Calling for help felt impossible. Too slow. Too loud. Too final. The scraping stopped. I waited for the door to burst open. It didn't. Instead, there was a soft knock. 3 taps. Polite. Controlled. The same cadence as before. Tap. Pause. Tap. Pause. Tap. My phone vibrated. One last chance to open it yourself. The meaning landed with sickening clarity. This wasn't about entry anymore. It was about choice. About forcing me to participate. About control. I shook my head instinctively even though they couldn't see me. My body curled inward, arms wrapped around my knees, nails digging into fabric. I wanted to disappear. I wanted the room to swallow me whole. The knock came again. Harder this time. The door shook violently as weight slammed into it. The lock shrieked, wood splintering slightly around the frame. I screamed then. I couldn't stop it. The sound tore out of me, raw and uncontrolled, filling the room, the apartment, the building. The impact stopped abruptly. Silence. Then laughter. Muffled by the door, distorted by wood and fear, but unmistakable. Low. Breathless. Intimate. As if spoken directly against the surface separating us. I scrambled for the window, panic overriding caution. I grabbed the curtain and yanked it aside, desperate for light, for escape, for anything. What I saw stole the breath from my lungs. A face. Right there, pressed close to the glass, so close that I could see condensation where they were breathing against it. The features were partially obscured by darkness, but the eyes were clear, wide, focused, watching me with an intensity that felt almost reverent. The smile was small, satisfied. The power surged back on at that exact moment. The bedroom flooded with harsh white light, and the face was gone. Aftermath. The sudden return of electricity didn't feel like rescue. It felt like exposure. The lamp was still off, but the overhead hallway light outside the bedroom snapped back on, and so did the ambient glow from the street. Sound returned in layers, the refrigerator's low hum, the faint hiss of the radiator waking up again, the distant, ordinary noise of a car passing on wet pavement. The television in the living room resumed, bright voices spilling into the apartment as if nothing had happened, as if the last minutes weren't real. I stayed frozen with the curtain clenched in my fist, my arm extended, my knuckles white. The window glass was cold against my palm where I'd braced myself. The courtyard beyond looked exactly as it always did. Stone floor, bare trees, metal railings, the trash bin tipped slightly to one side. Empty. No movement. No shadow. No sign that anything had been there at all. But I'd seen the face. The image had burned itself into my mind with the clarity of a camera flash. Not the full detail of it. My memory couldn't supply that cleanly, because fear had narrowed my perception. But the proximity, the certainty, the closeness of another human presence separated from me by a few millimeters of glass. The thin sheen of moisture where they had breathed. I backed away from the window slowly, the curtain slipping through my fingers and falling back into place. The moment the fabric covered the glass again, I felt a sharp, irrational relief, like closing my eyes when you know something is in front of you, but you can't bear to confirm it. Then my legs gave out. I sat down hard on the edge of the bed, both hands still shaking violently. The adrenaline didn't drain. It kept cycling, keeping my muscles clenched, my stomach tight. My mouth tasted metallic, like I'd bitten my tongue. I swallowed and realized my throat hurt from screaming. For several seconds, I just listened, trying to make sense of the apartment's sounds. Everything seemed too normal, too indifferent. The world had not changed to match what I had experienced, and that mismatch made me feel unstable, like I'd stepped out of sync with reality. The bedroom door stood closed, intact, but the frame was damaged. A thin line of splintered wood had opened near the latch where the impact had struck. It was small, almost insignificant, but it was proof that something had physically happened. That mattered. Proof mattered. I forced myself off the bed and approached the door on unsteady legs. Each step felt like walking through deep water. I put my hand on the handle and immediately pulled it back, terrified of what I might feel on the other side. Warmth from another hand, pressure, the sense of someone still there. Nothing moved. I took a breath, then unlocked the door. The click sounded louder than it had any right to. I opened it a few centimeters, peering through the gap into the hallway. Empty. The apartment's hallway light was on, steady and dull. The bathroom door was closed. The living room beyond flickered with the television's glow. Everything looked exactly as it had earlier, except for the subtle shift in my own perception. The corners seemed deeper, the distances shorter, the air charged. I stepped out of the bedroom. The first thing I noticed was the smell. The smoky, sweet scent that had been seeping in was fading now, thinning rapidly, like smoke dissipating after a door has opened. I inhaled carefully, trying to capture it, to identify it, but it was already slipping away into the ordinary odors of my apartment. Detergent, cold air, stale heat from the radiator. I moved through the rooms methodically, almost mechanically, checking every door, every window, every shadowed space. The bathroom was empty. The closet, under the kitchen sink, behind the shower curtain. Each confirmation should have made me feel safer, but it only deepened the confusion. If no one was inside now, where had they been? If they had left, how? The front door was still locked. The windows were still secured. There was no broken glass, no forced entry visible from inside. When I reached the living room, I stood in front of the window and stared at the curtain. My hands hovered, unwilling to touch it again. The street outside continued as it had all evening. A couple of people walked past, shoulders hunched, carrying bags. Lights blinked. A distant siren wailed somewhere far away and then faded. I pulled the curtain aside quickly, forcing myself to look. The street was there. The sidewalk. The opposite buildings. No one directly outside my window. No one looking up. No obvious hiding place, not at that angle, not that close. If someone had been standing there, they would have had to step back into the street, into visibility, or press themselves flat against the wall beside the window. I leaned to the side, trying to see the narrow strip of space along the building's facade. Nothing. I felt something inside me sag, not with relief, but with the sick realization that they could have been there seconds earlier and vanished without leaving evidence, either because they were practiced or because the environment itself gave them cover I couldn't grasp. I went to the front door next. The peephole showed the corridor outside, empty, the same weak yellow light, the same unremarkable doors. I unlocked my deadbolt with trembling fingers, then stopped. The idea of opening the door felt like stepping into open water at night. I hovered there, listening. Silence. I opened it. The hallway was empty, but the air smelled faintly of that same sweet smoke, lingering like a fingerprint. I stepped out just enough to look left and right. The corridor stretched in both directions, each door shut, the stairwell at one end, the elevator at the other. Nothing moved. I looked down. On the floor, directly in front of my door, was something small and pale against the darker tiles. A strip of paper. It had been folded lengthwise, placed neatly, as if someone had set it down with care. I stared at it for a long time before bending to pick it up. My fingers hesitated, then pinched it gently, as if it might be contaminated. It was a piece of torn flyer paper, not a full sheet, just a narrow strip with printed text, cut from something larger. The words on it were familiar. Merry Christmas. The same phrase as the message, printed in bold, part of a larger design I could no longer see. My hand started shaking harder. I looked up and down the hallway again, expecting to see someone watching from the stairwell from behind a door cracked open. Nothing. I retreated into my apartment and closed the door, locking it, then locking it again as if double effort could compensate for the impossibility of what had just happened. I backed away, still holding the strip of paper, staring at it as if it might change shape in my hand. My phone was still in my pocket. It felt heavy, like a piece of evidence I didn't want. I pulled it out. There were no new messages, no missed calls. The images and texts from the unknown number were still there. I scrolled through them, forcing myself to look again, to confirm that I hadn't imagined them. My hands were so unsteady that the screen blurred. Then I noticed something I hadn't registered earlier. The second photo, the close one of my living room window, had a reflection in it that didn't match what I remembered. Not my silhouette, something behind me. In the reflection, faint and distorted, was the outline of a tall shape standing in the darkness of my hallway near the kitchen. A suggestion of shoulders, a head, a presence. I stared at it until my eyes watered. I had not been alone in my apartment when that photo was taken. That realization hit me in a way that eclipsed everything else. The tapping at the window, the shadow under the door, the face pressed against the glass, all of it rearranged itself in my mind. If someone had been inside, then the outside presence could have been misdirection. The power outage could have been deliberate. The messages weren't just observation from the street, they were coordination. I dropped the phone onto the couch as if it burned. The apartment felt suddenly vast and unsafe, every room a potential hiding place again, despite the fact I had just checked them. My skin crawled with the sensation of being watched from behind, from corners, from spaces I couldn't see without turning my head. I forced myself to pick the phone up again and dial the emergency number. My thumb hesitated over the call button, and for a moment shame tried to surface. What would I even say? Someone tapped on my window? Someone sent me photos? Someone might have been inside, but I'm not sure. But the splintered door frame and the paper strip in my hand were real. My terror was real. The reflection was there, frozen in pixels. I pressed call. The line rang once, twice. Each ring felt like a lifetime. A voice answered. Calm. Professional. Ordinary. I tried to speak and my throat tightened. When I finally managed, my voice came out hoarse, uneven. I gave my address, stumbling over the street name. I told them someone was outside and possibly inside, that my power had gone out, that they'd tried the lock. The operator asked questions. Was the person still there? Had they entered? Were there weapons? Was I injured? Each question felt like an accusation that I should have clearer answers. I said I didn't know. I said I didn't see them now. I said I was alone, but the words felt uncertain even as I spoke them. They told me to stay inside, lock the door, go somewhere safe, don't approach windows, wait for officers. I did what I was told. I took my phone and the paper strip and went into the bathroom because it had the smallest window and the most solid door. I sat on the closed toilet lid with my back against the wall. The tiles were cold through my thin clothes. My breath came in shallow bursts. I kept my eyes on the bathroom door handle, waiting for it to move again. Time became elastic. Minutes stretched, then contracted. I couldn't tell if I was waiting 5 minutes or 50. My phone's screen showed 22:06 at one point, then 22:12. I stared at the numbers until they lost meaning. At 22:19, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment. Heavy, distinct, accompanied by voices. Keys clinked. A knock on my front door, firm, authoritative, nothing like the tapping that had started this. Polizia. I didn't move immediately. My body didn't trust the sound. I waited, listening for a second voice, a confirmation. Signore? È lei che ha chiamato? Polizia. I stood slowly, my legs stiff. I opened the bathroom door, moved down the hallway, and approached the front door with a caution that felt ridiculous but necessary. I looked through the peephole. 2 uniformed officers stood there, faces lit by the hallway light. One held a flashlight. The other had a small notebook in hand. My body sagged with a relief so intense it almost knocked me over. I opened the door. They asked me to step back inside, to keep the door partly closed. Their eyes scanned over my shoulder into the apartment. They asked me what happened, and as I began to explain, my voice broke. Not into sobs, but into something worse. A trembling, fragmented recounting that made me sound unreliable even to myself. They entered, methodical, checking rooms, closets, windows. One of them examined the damaged doorframe on the bedroom. He ran his fingers over the splintered wood, frowning. Qualcuno ha spinto, he said quietly. Someone had pushed. I showed them the strip of paper. I showed them the messages, the photos. They looked at the screen carefully, exchanged glances. The younger officer asked if I recognized the number. I didn't. He asked if I had enemies, an ex, anyone who might do this. I shook my head. My life felt too small to produce that kind of attention. They asked about building access. I told them about the main door sometimes not latching. I told them I often heard nothing in the building on holidays. They nodded, the older officer's expression tightening in a way that suggested he was thinking about how easy it would be for someone to enter unnoticed. They went out into the hallway, checked the stairwell, went down to the courtyard. I stayed inside, watching through the doorway, feeling like a child waiting for adults to restore order. The television still played in the background, absurdly cheerful, and at some point, one of the officers turned it off without comment. The sudden quiet felt appropriate, like mourning. When they returned, they said they found no one. No footprints they could confidently identify, no broken locks, no signs of forced entry beyond my bedroom door. The courtyard was empty. The building's main entrance was closed properly when they checked it. They took notes, asked me to send the images to an official email address. They advised me to stay with someone if I could, at least for the night. They suggested changing locks, speaking with building management, installing a security camera if possible. Their words were practical, but their eyes carried a subtle unease. They had seen enough to know something about my story didn't sit comfortably in the category of ordinary harassment. After they left, the apartment felt worse than before. Not because it was quieter, but because it was mine again. The officers had brought a temporary sense of structure. Without them, the space reverted to uncertainty. Every corner had memory now. Every window was no longer just glass, but a surface that could hold a face. I didn't sleep there that night. I packed a bag with shaking hands. I kept expecting my phone to vibrate again. It didn't. That silence felt intentional too, as if the presence that had tormented me had decided it had done enough. I went out into the stairwell with the bag over my shoulder. The lights seemed harsher now, casting shadows that looked too sharp. On the way down, I noticed the smell again, faint but present, like burnt paper lingering after a candle is snuffed. At the building's main entrance, I paused. The city outside was cold and damp. Holiday lights blinked. A couple walked by laughing, their breath forming small clouds. Everything looked normal, and that normality made my skin crawl. I went to a friend's apartment across town, waking her with a call I barely remember making. She let me in without questions, her face soft with confusion and concern. In her living room, among her own furniture, her own smells, I felt slightly more anchored, but the sensation of being watched didn't leave. In the days that followed, I tried to treat what happened like an incident that had ended. I filed a report. I changed the locks. I asked the building manager about the main entrance latch. He shrugged, promised to look into it, and never did. I bought a cheap camera and pointed it at my front door. The first nights back in the apartment, I slept in short bursts, waking at every click of the radiator, every distant elevator movement. No more messages came, no more tapping. But the absence didn't heal anything. It only made room for possibility, because I still had the photos. I still had the reflection. And I still had that moment when the power returned and the face vanished, as if the darkness had been a curtain they controlled, as if visibility itself had been part of their design. Weeks later, I noticed something on my phone that I hadn't checked that night, the metadata of the images. I'm not an expert, but I know enough to tap details and see timestamps, file information. The images were taken within seconds of the messages, consistent with what I'd felt. But one of them, the one of my front door from the outside, contained location data. Not coordinates I recognized, but a tagged location name. It was the name of my building. It meant the photo was taken close enough, precisely enough, for the phone to register where it was. That alone should have been expected. What made my stomach drop was the accuracy of the tag. Not just the street, not just the neighborhood, but the building itself. As if the device had connected to a known network, a known place. As if whoever had taken the photo had been inside long enough before to have their phone register it as familiar. I tried to convince myself that was normal, that location services could be broad, that phones mislabel places. I tried. But the attempt felt weak, like paper over a hole. I moved out 3 months later. I told people it was for work, for convenience. I didn't describe the real reason because the real reason sounded like superstition, like paranoia, like weakness. I didn't want to be the person in the friend group who believed in something unexplained. But the truth is, even after I left, I never stopped feeling as if that night had marked me. Every Christmas Eve since then, I keep the lights on. Not festive lights, harsh practical lights. I lock doors twice. I check windows more than once. If my phone buzzes unexpectedly, my body still tightens before my mind can catch up. I still smell sometimes in crowded places, that faint sweetness under smoke, and my stomach turns as if something has stepped too close. I have never received another message from that number. When I tried to call it a few days after the incident, it didn't ring. It didn't go to voicemail. It simply failed, as if it never existed. The police told me that happens sometimes with certain services' temporary numbers. Their tone suggested I should accept that answer and move on. I still have the screenshots saved in multiple places. I can't bring myself to delete them because they're proof, and proof matters. But I also can't look at them for long, because the longer I stare, the more I notice small things. The angle of light, the texture of my door, the shape in the reflection that doesn't resolve into a clear person. Just a presence. The most unsettling part isn't that I can't explain what happened. It's that parts of it were explainable. Too explainable. Someone was outside. Someone tried the lock. Someone sent messages. That fits within human cruelty and obsession. But other parts, the way the power went out and returned at precise moments, the way the face was there and then gone with the light, the way the building felt like it was holding its breath, those details don't fit as neatly. They hover at the edge of rationality, refusing to be filed away. Sometimes I tell myself the face wasn't real. It was a trick of reflection, my mind filling in a shape. But my body rejects that. My body remembers the proximity, the certainty of eyes meeting mine through glass. And on certain nights, when the air is damp and the city is quiet, I wake up suddenly with my jaw clenched and my heart racing, convinced I've heard a soft tap. Not a knock. Not a bang. A fingertip testing whether I'm still there. Story 2, Christmas Eve. Someone came inside. Introduction. I don't tell people I hate Christmas Eve. Hate sounds childish, like a tantrum you never outgrew. When someone asks why I'm never enthusiastic about the 24th, I usually give an answer that fits inside a normal conversation. I say I'm not sentimental. I say I don't care for traditions. I say I prefer quiet nights and early sleep. It keeps faces from changing. It keeps people from asking follow-up questions. But the truth is that Christmas Eve is the only date on the calendar that still feels like it can reach into my body and tighten something around my ribs. I can be fine all year, steady job, steady routines, a life that looks calm from the outside, and then December 24th arrives and I start moving differently without meaning to. I check locks twice. I listen for sounds I'd normally filter out. My throat stays dry. My appetite disappears even when the kitchen smells good. I catch myself staring at windows the way you stare at a dark doorway when you're not sure whether you left it open. I don't decorate. I don't drink. I don't put on music to set the mood. I wait for the day to pass, and I do it with a kind of attention that feels humiliating, like I'm still 8 years old and the night is still ahead of me. I was 8 years old when it happened, which is an age people treat like a built-in excuse. Adults hear 8 and assume whatever I remember must be warped. They imagine childish fear turning ordinary shadows into monsters. For a long time I tried to agree with them, even when I never said it out loud. I tried to sand the night down into something harmless, a misunderstanding, a coincidence, a vivid dream that leaked into waking life because I was overtired and sugared up on holiday food. The older I got, the less that worked. Memory didn't soften. It hardened. It grew edges. Certain details stayed in my body more faithfully than anything I learned in school. The smell of wet wool in a heated room. The sound a door handle makes when someone tests it gently. The way a house can feel suddenly too large for the people inside it. Our house back then sat at the edge of a neighborhood that looked ordinary in daylight and uneasy at night. Rows of similar homes, small front gardens, driveways with the same two cars, the kind of street where the same dogs barked behind the same fences every evening. In December, families strung lights along gutters and wrapped bushes and trees like they were bandaging them against the cold. The bulbs flickered in damp air. When it rained, the colors bled into the pavement and made the road look slick and painted, like a place built for a celebration rather than a place people actually lived. At the far end of our street, there was a strip of woods. Not a deep forest, just a leftover patch of trees that had survived development and become a place people didn't know what to do with. In summer, kids cut through it on their bikes to reach a convenience store and the bus stop. In winter, it turned into a black shape at the end of the neighborhood, a silent mass that swallowed light. From my bedroom window, I could see the first line of trunks, dark and wet, and beyond them a deeper darkness that made the street lamp glow look weak, almost embarrassed. Christmas Eve changed the whole sound of the neighborhood. Even as a child, I could feel it. People were inside. Doors stayed shut. The usual evening noises, cars coming and going, someone dragging a trash bin to the curb, a distant television through an open window, were replaced by softer layers, laughter behind walls, plates clinking, the faint rise and fall of music that stopped abruptly when someone closed a door. Outside, the air felt emptied out, as if the street itself were listening. Inside our house, everything was supposed to be warm and bright. My mother had been cooking since mid-afternoon. The air smelled like roasting meat, sweet pastry, citrus peel, and that sharp, clean bite of pine from the Christmas tree we'd brought in 2 days earlier. The tree stood in the corner of the living room, still shedding needles into the carpet like tiny green stitches. Its lights were simple, warm white, and the cords snaked behind the stand where my father kept stepping on them by accident. Every time he did, one strand would blink, and my mother would snap his name under her breath, not loud enough to count as a fight, but sharp enough to carry. I remember being too wound up to sit still. I remember the itch of my holiday sweater against my neck, the kind of wool that looks festive but feels like punishment. I remember my legs swinging off the dining chair because my feet didn't reach the floor properly. I remember the living room light reflecting in the dark TV screen and making my face look pale when I walked past it. I was excited in the pure physical way kids are, energy in my limbs, thoughts jumping ahead, impatience buzzing under my skin. We had a routine my parents insisted on because they liked the feeling of control it gave them. After dinner, we would drive to my grandparents' house across town. We would exchange gifts there, drink hot chocolate, stay up too late, then come home close to midnight. At home, my sister and I would put out cookies and milk. I believed in Santa then, but not as a fairy tale. It was more like believing in a rule of the world. If you followed instructions, if you didn't peek, if you went to bed, then the morning would arrive with proof you had done it correctly. That night, something small broke the routine early, and it's one of the reasons everything that followed has never sat right. My father realized we were out of wrapping paper. Not an emergency, but it irritated him the way small inconveniences do when a day already feels packed tight. He decided to go to the convenience store at the end of the neighborhood because it stayed open late. He said it would take 10 minutes. He said it like 10 minutes were a sealed container, something you could measure and trust. My mother didn't want him to go alone, but not for any dramatic reason. She was tired and annoyed, and she didn't like being left to manage everything while he did one more errand. They had a low, tense conversation in the doorway between the kitchen and the hallway. Words kept quiet because my sister and I were there. My sister pretended not to listen, staring at the TV with the remote in her hand. I listened anyway because children always do. Their voices had that controlled sharpness adults use when they don't want to be overheard, which only makes you listen harder. In the end, my father grabbed his keys and his coat and went out. The front door opened, and cold air rushed in hard enough to make the lower branches of the tree tremble. The smell of wet night slid into the warm house. Then the door shut, and the warmth settled back into place as if it had been disturbed and corrected. I remember looking at the front window after that, the one by the entryway where you could see the street. At night, the glass reflected the inside of our house more than it showed the yard. I could see my own small face superimposed over the lights of the tree, and behind the reflection, the street lamp cast a pale circle onto wet pavement. Everything looked normal, framed like a picture you'd hang to prove a family was safe. Then I noticed the neighbors' Christmas lights across the street weren't on. It sounds like nothing. It would have been nothing any other night. But that house was always aggressively decorated, strings along the roof, blinking icicles, a plastic reindeer that looked permanently startled. That year, the man who lived there had put up a new set of lights that changed colors slowly, like a heartbeat. I used to stare at them because they made the dark outside feel less empty, like the neighborhood had a pulse. Now their yard was black. The roofline was a hard silhouette. The windows looked sealed, dead. Even the porch light was off. It was as if the house had decided to vanish while staying in place. I asked my mother why their lights were off. She didn't look up from what she was doing. She said maybe they'd blown a fuse. She told me to stop hovering. Her voice had the tired edge it always got when she was trying to do too many things at once, and I obeyed because that was the easiest way to keep the evening smooth. I went back to the living room and tried to focus on the television, but the images didn't hold me. I had a tight, unsettled feeling I couldn't name. Not fear yet. Something smaller and more physical, like the first hint of motion sickness. I kept glancing toward the front window without realizing I was doing it, as if the darkness beyond the glass had become something I needed to monitor. A few minutes later, the phone rang. It was the old house phone mounted on the wall, beige plastic with a cord stretched too far because my mother always pulled it away from its base when she talked. The ring was loud in the warm room, sharp and almost angry. My mother wiped her hands on a towel and answered. I could hear only her side, just enough to tell that the call wasn't normal holiday chatter. She said my father wasn't home yet. She said yes, she understood. She said no, she hadn't noticed anything. Then she asked who was calling. There was a pause long enough that the air in the room seemed to thicken around it. My sister turned the TV down without being told. Even the house's ordinary noises, heater hum, refrigerator click, felt like they were waiting. My mother's face tightened, and she hung up without saying goodbye. She looked at us as if deciding how much of what she'd just heard she could allow into the room. Then she forced her expression into something neutral and told me to go wash my hands for dessert. I did what I was told, but the hallway felt colder than it should have. The light over the bathroom flickered once as I walked past, a quick dip and return, like an eyelid blinking. I turned on the tap and watched the water run, too hot at first, then suddenly cold, and the abrupt change made me flinch. While I washed my hands, I heard the front door handle rattle. Not the sound of a key turning. Just the handle moving, a quick test, as if someone had tried it and then let go. It was subtle, the kind of sound you would miss if you weren't already paying attention. I froze with my hands under the water. My heart began to beat harder, the way it does when you're caught doing something you're not supposed to. I stared at my reflection in the mirror above the sink. My face looked small and pale, eyes wide, soap still on my fingers. The handle rattled again. Then nothing. I dried my hands too slowly, listening. The house was quiet except for the dull murmur of my mother moving in the kitchen. I told myself it was my father, that he'd come back, that he didn't have his keys in his hand yet, that he was being impatient. But no one opened the door. No one called my name. No footsteps crossed the entryway. I walked back down the hallway, and my mother was standing in the kitchen doorway with the phone in her hand, staring toward the front of the house. She had gone very still, the way adults do when they're trying not to alarm children. Her shoulders were raised slightly, as if she'd forgotten to exhale. I asked if Dad was back. She said, "Stay in the living room," and the calmness in her voice was too carefully placed, like a blanket pulled tight over something messy. Her fingers were white around the phone. That was the first moment I felt it clearly. The sensation that something outside our house had noticed us, and that our warm rooms and holiday smells and strict routines were not enough to keep it out. And that was only the beginning. Text background. Before that night, Christmas Eve had always felt structured in a way that made the world seem dependable. Even as a child, I clung to patterns. I liked knowing what came next. Dinner, coats, the drive across town, familiar voices, the same jokes from relatives I barely saw the rest of the year. The predictability wrapped the night in something solid. It told me that no matter how dark it got outside, nothing truly unexpected would happen as long as we followed the steps in the right order. Our family wasn't especially emotional or expressive. My parents didn't talk about fear or anxiety. Those things were treated like inconveniences, something you handled quietly and moved past. If you cried, you were asked why. If you said you were scared, you were told there was nothing to be scared of. That wasn't cruelty, it was just how they believed you prepared a child for the world. You didn't dwell. You didn't imagine. You learned early how to fold yourself back into calm. Our house reflected that mindset. Everything had a place. Shoes lined up by the door, coats on assigned hooks, lights turned off the moment a room was empty. Even decorations were measured. The Christmas tree was never overly tall, never leaned, never overloaded with ornaments. My mother liked symmetry. My father liked things that worked the way they were supposed to. Together, they created a home that felt orderly, safe, and closed to whatever existed beyond its walls. That sense of closure mattered because the neighborhood itself had always felt slightly exposed. The street curved gently, just enough that you couldn't see its full length from any single point. At night, that curve swallowed headlights and made approaching cars appear suddenly, as if they'd emerged from nowhere. The woods at the end of the road added to that feeling. Adults treated them like a non-issue, but children understood instinctively that they were a place without rules. In summer, the trees were noisy with insects and birds. In winter, they were silent. Snow muffled everything. Darkness pooled between the trunks. I'd never gone far into those woods. I didn't need to. From my bedroom window, they were already close enough. At night, when the wind moved through them, branches creaked in a way that sounded almost deliberate, like slow movement rather than weather. I used to imagine shapes there, not monsters, not figures, just the idea that something could stand very still and never be noticed. I didn't think of it often, but the idea existed, stored away without language. That Christmas Eve, the house was fuller than usual before my father left. The kitchen table was crowded with serving dishes. Coats were piled on a chair instead of hung properly because we were leaving soon anyway. The living room floor held gift bags and boxes waiting to be loaded into the car. The order of the house had been temporarily loosened, and even at 8 years old I could feel the tension that caused in my parents. They moved faster, spoke shorter, corrected small things that didn't matter. My sister was older than me by 4 years, old enough to be bored by tradition and irritated by my excitement. She hovered in doorways, scrolling channels, sighing loudly when my mother asked her to help. That night, though, she seemed quieter than usual. She stayed closer to the living room, legs tucked under her on the couch, remote resting idle in her hand. I didn't notice it consciously at the time, but later it stood out. She wasn't restless. She was watchful. The phone call had shifted something in the house that none of us could quite name. My mother didn't explain it. She didn't need to. Her movements became deliberate in a way that made me hyper-aware of my own. She set the phone back on its hook more carefully than usual. She adjusted the curtains at the front window so they overlapped fully, erasing the narrow gap she usually left to let in street light. She turned on the hallway lamp even though it was early enough that she normally wouldn't have bothered. When adults change their behavior without explanation, children feel it immediately. The house hadn't become dangerous yet, but it had become alert. Every sound seemed to travel farther. The tick of the clock in the kitchen felt louder. The heater cycling on made me jump. I kept imagining my father's car pulling into the driveway, the familiar crunch of tires on gravel, but those sounds didn't come. My mother told my sister and me to sit together on the couch. She put on a movie we'd both seen before, something cheerful and harmless, the kind of thing that was meant to signal normalcy. The volume was turned up slightly louder than necessary. She stayed standing, wiping already clean counters, rearranging objects that didn't need rearranging. Her eyes kept drifting toward the front of the house. I remember feeling an odd pressure in my chest, like the air was heavier. I shifted positions constantly, trying to get comfortable. The couch fabric felt rough against my hands. The room smelled sweet and rich from dinner, but underneath it was another smell I couldn't place then, a colder scent, damp and faintly metallic, like rain-soaked concrete carried inside on someone's shoes. At some point, my sister leaned close and whispered that Dad was taking too long. Her voice was low, careful. It wasn't fear exactly, but it wasn't boredom either. I shrugged, trying to be casual, but my eyes were already drifting back to the window, now fully curtained, the glass reflecting the room instead of the street. The rattle at the door replayed itself in my head again and again. It hadn't been loud. It hadn't been violent. That was what made it worse. It was the sound of someone checking, not entering. The sound of curiosity rather than urgency. As a child, I didn't have those words, but my body understood the difference. It felt different from my father's usual arrival, different from a neighbor knocking, different from the door being buffeted by wind. When my mother finally sat down on the arm of the couch, she placed one hand on my shoulder and left it there. Her grip was light, but firm enough that I could feel it even through my sweater. She didn't say anything reassuring. She didn't need to. The contact itself was the message. Stay here, stay still. Minutes passed without shape. I didn't know how to measure them. The movie played on, characters laughing at things that felt distant and artificial. Outside, a car passed, headlights briefly sliding across the curtain fabric like a searchlight before disappearing again. Each time that happened, my heart jumped, then dropped when the sound faded. Eventually, the phone rang again. This time, my mother answered immediately. She spoke more quietly than before, turning slightly away from us. I couldn't hear the words, but I could hear the strain beneath them. Her free hand pressed against the counter as if she needed the support. When she hung up, she didn't look at us right away. She stood still, breathing in through her nose, out through her mouth, slow and controlled. She told us my father's car had stalled near the edge of the neighborhood. She said he was walking back with someone from a nearby house to get help. She said everything was fine. The explanation slid into place too easily, like a puzzle piece forced where it almost fit. Even at 8, I could sense the effort behind it. She was giving us a reason that would prevent questions, a story that would hold us in place for a little while longer. But the unease didn't lift. If anything, it settled deeper, because now I knew my father wasn't just late. He was somewhere between the house and the dark end of the street, close to the woods, away from light and routine. And someone else knew that too. I didn't yet understand how that knowledge would shape the rest of the night. I only knew that Christmas Eve had stopped feeling like a celebration and started feeling like a waiting room, one where something unseen was moving closer, slowly, without urgency, confident it had time. But first, irregularities. After my mother explained about my father's car, the house settled into a strange imitation of calm. Nothing visibly changed, but everything felt slightly misaligned, like furniture moved a few centimeters out of place. The movie continued to play, but no one laughed. The sound was just there to fill the space, to keep silence from becoming too noticeable. I stared at the screen without following the story, my attention drifting toward every noise the house made. The first thing I noticed was how quiet the street had become. Not peaceful quiet, empty quiet. The kind that makes you aware of how much sound there usually is, even when you don't register it consciously. No passing cars, no distant voices, not even the wind moving through the trees at the end of the road. It felt as if the neighborhood had been gently sealed, sound pressed out of it. My mother stood up again and went to the front window. She adjusted the curtain a fraction of an inch, just enough to look out without being obvious. I watched her reflection in the dark glass. Her face looked older than usual, sharper, the skin around her mouth tight. She didn't stay there long. She stepped back and crossed her arms, rubbing her hands together as if she were cold. That was when I heard the sound outside. At first I thought it was water dripping from the gutter. It was soft and irregular, easy to dismiss. A light tapping, then a pause, then another. I waited for it to turn into something familiar. Wind, a branch, a car door. It didn't. The sound stayed small and precise. Tap, pause. Tap. It wasn't coming from the roof. It wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the side of the house, near the living room window. My body reacted before my thoughts did. My shoulders lifted. My stomach tightened. I slid closer to my sister on the couch without realizing I was moving. She noticed. I felt her shift too, our arms pressing together briefly. Neither of us said anything. The tapping stopped. The silence afterward felt heavier than before, as if it had gained weight. I counted in my head the way I did when I was nervous, waiting for the next sound. Nothing came. My breathing sounded loud to me. I tried to slow it down. My mother asked if we'd heard that. The question landed wrong. Adults don't usually ask children to confirm sounds unless they already believe something is wrong. My sister nodded slightly. I nodded too. My mother didn't respond. She just walked toward the hallway, stopping near the front door, listening. A few seconds later, the tapping returned. This time it was clearer, closer. It came from the front of the house, not the side. The rhythm was the same, measured, deliberate. It wasn't knocking. It was lighter than that, like someone touching the surface with the tips of their fingers. I felt a cold sensation crawl up the back of my neck. My mouth went dry. I wanted it to be my father. I wanted it desperately. But even at 8, I knew the sound of my father at the door. He knocked once firmly. He rattled his keys. He didn't tap. My mother reached for the hallway light switch and turned it off. The living room suddenly felt brighter by comparison, the Christmas tree lights glowing softly in the corner. The rest of the house fell into shadow. The choice was intentional. I understood that instinctively. She didn't want whoever was outside to see movement deeper in the house. The tapping stopped again. We waited. Seconds stretched. The movie characters spoke, laughed, moved through their own safe world. None of it reached me. I stared at the front door, at the narrow strip of darkness beneath it, half expecting to see light or shadow appear there. Instead, I heard footsteps. They weren't on our porch. They were on the driveway. Slow. Careful. Someone walking without urgency, without the uneven rhythm of someone in a hurry. Gravel shifted under weight. The sound traveled through the walls, clear enough that I could tell the steps were moving away from the front door, toward the side of the house, toward the living room window. My sister grabbed my wrist. Her fingers were cold and tight. I didn't pull away. My heart began to pound hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the tapping came again, this time directly against the glass. It was faint, but unmistakable. A small, dry sound, different from the hollow knock of knuckles on wood. Closer, more intimate. As if whoever was outside was close enough to breathe against the window. My mother whispered my name. Just once, not loud enough to be heard outside. The way you speak when you're trying to keep a child anchored to you. She motioned for us to stay seated. I wanted to look at the window. Every part of me wanted to turn my head and confirm what my body already believed. But I couldn't. Fear held my gaze in place, locked on the floor in front of the couch. I stared at the fibers of the carpet, at a small green pine needle that had fallen from the tree earlier and been ground into the fabric. The tapping stopped. Then the handle on the front door moved. Not a full turn, just a slight shift. The sound was soft, controlled, the way someone checks whether a door is locked without committing to it. The metal made a faint click as it settled back into place. My sister let out a small sound she tried to swallow. My mother raised one finger to her lips, her face pale in the glow of the tree lights. I could see the pulse beating in her neck. No one spoke. The handle didn't move again. The footsteps didn't return. The house sat in that suspended moment, every object holding its breath. That was when the smell reached us. It crept into the room gradually, so faint at first that I thought I imagined it. A damp, cold smell like wet leaves and soil mixed with something sharper. Metal, oil. The scent of the outside carried too far inside to be accidental. It didn't belong with pine and sugar and cooked food. My mother noticed it too. I could tell by the way her expression shifted, her nose wrinkling slightly. She stood up slowly and walked toward the kitchen, then stopped halfway, reconsidering. She turned back to us instead, her movements cautious. She told us to stand up. Her voice was quiet but firm, the kind of tone that didn't allow questions. She guided us away from the living room, toward the hallway, keeping her body between us and the front of the house. As we moved, the tapping started again, this time louder, more impatient. Not knocking, scratching. A faint, dragging sound against the wood of the door, as if something hard was being pulled across its surface. Slow, testing, persistent. My stomach dropped. My legs felt weak, heavy. I clutched the sleeve of my mother's sweater, the wool rough against my fingers, grounding me in something real. We reached the hallway just as the scratching stopped. The silence that followed was not relief. It was expectation. Whatever was outside had learned something about us, and it was not done. Them escalating tension. The hallway felt narrower than it ever had before. I had walked through it thousands of times without noticing its shape, but now every detail pressed in on me. The framed photos along the wall, the slight dip in the floorboard near the coat closet, the way the light from the living room thinned as it stretched toward the back of the house. My mother guided us forward with one hand on each of our shoulders, her grip steady but tense, as if she were holding us in place against something unseen. She led us into the kitchen and stopped there listening. The kitchen had always been the brightest room at night, a square of safety where my mother seemed most in control. Now even that felt compromised. The overhead light hummed softly, a sound I'd never noticed before but couldn't ignore now. Outside the window above the sink, darkness pressed close, the glass reflecting our small, clustered shapes back at us. We stood there without speaking. My sister's fingers were still wrapped around my wrist, cutting off circulation just enough to make my hand tingle. I didn't pull away. The sensation anchored me. It told me I was still here, still solid. From the living room came another sound. Footsteps. Not on the porch this time. Inside the house. They were faint, almost polite, like someone shifting their weight carefully. A single step, then a pause. Then another. The sound came from the direction of the front door, moving inward, not deeper, but sideways, as if someone were pacing just beyond the threshold. My mother's breathing changed. I felt it through her hands before I heard it. Shorter, shallower. She turned off the kitchen light. The sudden dimness made my eyes sting. We were left with only the glow spilling weakly from the living room, the Christmas tree lights now the sole source of warmth in the house. The kitchen window became a black mirror. My own reflection stared back at me, eyes wide, mouth slightly open, a child who didn't understand what rule had just been broken. The footsteps stopped. A long silence followed, so complete it felt deliberate. I became aware of every small noise my body made, the soft rasp of my breath, the faint creak in my knees as I shifted my weight, the whisper of fabric when my sister moved closer. I wanted to be perfectly still. I wanted to become part of the house, something inanimate and uninteresting. Then the sound came again, closer. This time, it was unmistakably inside the walls. A slow, dragging noise along the hallway floor, like the careful movement of something being pulled rather than carried. It wasn't heavy enough to thud. It wasn't light enough to be dismissed. It suggested intent. My mother lowered herself slightly so her face was closer to ours. She whispered that we were going to the back bedroom. Her voice barely carried. She didn't explain why. She didn't need to. The back of the house felt farther away from whatever was testing our space. We moved together, slow and careful. Each step felt exaggerated, too loud in my own ears. As we passed the hallway mirror, I caught a glimpse of us reflected there. 3 figures pressed close, moving as one. For a split second, I thought I saw movement behind us in the reflection, something darker than shadow, but when I turned my head, there was nothing. The back bedroom had always been my parents' room. It smelled like clean laundry and old books. The curtains were thick, blocking out the yard entirely. My mother closed the door behind us and turned the lock. The click was quiet but final, a sound that made my stomach twist. We stood in the center of the room, unsure where to go. The bed loomed large, its edges dark. The dresser cast a long shadow across the floor. My mother guided us to sit on the bed, one on each side of her. The mattress dipped under our combined weight. She rested her hands on our knees, grounding us again. For a moment, there was nothing. Then the front door opened. The sound carried through the house clearly, unmistakably. The slow creak of hinges, controlled, unforced, not kicked, not broken. Opened the way a door opens when someone has taken the time to do it properly. I felt my sister's grip tighten until it hurt. My heart began to race so hard I thought it might shake my ribs apart. I waited for my father's voice, for the familiar sound of his keys dropping onto the table, for anything that would explain the sound in a way that didn't shatter the world I understood. Nothing came. Instead, the door closed again, softly. The footsteps followed. They were heavier now, confident, no longer testing, moving deeper into the house with the certainty of someone who knew where they were going. The sound traveled down the hallway, passing the living room, passing the kitchen, coming toward us. My mother's hands trembled where they rested on my legs. She pressed them down harder, a silent command to stay still. Her face had gone pale, the lines around her mouth rigid. She wasn't trying to reassure us anymore. She was listening, calculating, waiting. The footsteps stopped outside the bedroom door. I stared at the door handle. It was old brass, dulled with age, catching just enough light to glow faintly. I had seen that handle every day of my life. Now it looked unfamiliar, fragile, like something that could be turned too easily. There was a pause. Then the handle moved, slowly. It turned just enough to test resistance. The lock held. The handle settled back into place with a soft metallic sound. No one spoke. No one breathed. On the other side of the door, someone exhaled. The sound was low and controlled, close enough that it seemed to seep through the wood. Not rushed, not angry, just present. I pressed my face into my mother's side, the fabric of her sweater warm against my cheek. My body shook without my permission. I tried to make myself smaller, to fold inward, as if that could make me harder to notice. The handle didn't move again. Instead, something brushed against the door. Not a knock, not a scratch. A slow, deliberate drag, as if fingers were being drawn across the surface, feeling its shape, its texture, learning it. Then the sound moved away. Footsteps retreated down the hallway, unhurried, as if whoever was there had already found what they came for. We stayed frozen long after the sounds faded. I don't know how much time passed. It could have been seconds or minutes. The house felt altered, its familiar layout rearranged by something intangible. Even in the back bedroom, with the door locked and the curtains closed, I felt exposed. Somewhere in the distance, a car engine started. Headlights swept briefly across the backyard, light filtering through the edges of the curtains. The sound of tires on gravel followed. My mother let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for too long. But even then, even as hope tried to surface, something inside me stayed clenched. Because whoever had been in our house hadn't rushed. They hadn't panicked. They had moved like time was on their side. And that meant the night wasn't over yet. 3. Critical incident. The sound of the car outside should have broken the tension completely. Any other night it would have. The familiar engine, the recognizable rhythm of tires slowing near the driveway. Those sounds belong to our world, the one with rules and explanations. But this time they didn't dissolve what had happened. They only interrupted it, like a hand raised in the middle of a sentence. The footsteps inside the house did not return. That was the first thing I noticed, even as my mother finally stood up from the bed. The front door had opened and closed. Someone had walked through our home, tested a locked bedroom door, and then left without urgency. And now, with the car outside, there was no immediate sign that whoever it was had reacted to its arrival. My mother told us to stay put. Her voice was still quiet, but it shook slightly now, the control wearing thin. She crossed the room and stood near the door, listening again. I could see her hand hovering near the lock, unsure whether to turn it. Then my father's voice called out from the hallway. He sounded confused, not frightened, not angry, just uncertain, the way people sound when something doesn't line up with what they expect. He said my mother's name once, then again louder. He asked why the lights were off. My mother unlocked the door and opened it a few inches. Light spilled in from the hallway. My father stood there, coat half unbuttoned, keys in his hand, his hair damp from mist. His face was pale, but that was easy to explain. Cold, frustration, the inconvenience of a broken car on Christmas Eve. He looked past her into the room and frowned when he saw us sitting rigidly on the bed. "What's going on?" he asked. My mother didn't answer right away. She stepped aside and let him in, then locked the door again behind him. The click echoed too loudly in the small room. She told him in clipped, careful sentences that someone had been at the house. She didn't embellish. She didn't dramatize. She described sounds, movements, the door handle, the footsteps. As she spoke, my father's expression changed. Not to disbelief, which would have been easier to process, but to focus. He listened the way he did when something mechanical went wrong, when a problem presented itself that needed diagnosis. His jaw tightened. He nodded slowly. He said he hadn't seen anyone on the street when he pulled in. He said the neighborhood had felt strange, too quiet even for the holiday. He mentioned that as he walked back from where his car had stalled, he thought he'd heard footsteps behind him more than once, but every time he turned around, there was no one there. He said he'd assumed it was someone else heading home for the night. He hadn't assumed it anymore. He told us to stay in the bedroom while he checked the house. My mother argued, quietly but urgently. My father insisted. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't show fear. That steadiness in hindsight was worse than panic. It meant he was taking the situation seriously enough to be careful. He left the room, closing the door behind him. I remember staring at the handle again, the brass dulled by years of use, trying to imagine it turning from the other side one more time. My sister pressed her shoulder against mine. My mother stood between us and the door, her back straight, her hands clenched at her sides. We heard my father move through the house. Each room announced itself with sound, a light switch, a door opening, a drawer sliding. He checked the living room first. Then the kitchen, the bathroom, the spare room. The sounds were methodical, controlled. He wasn't searching frantically. He was confirming absence. At one point, he stopped moving entirely. The pause stretched long enough that my mother took a step toward the door before stopping herself. I felt my heart begin to race again, my breath turning shallow. Then he spoke. He said there was mud on the living room carpet. Not a lot, just enough to notice if you were looking for it. Damp footprints leading from the front door toward the hallway, not deep enough to leave clear tread patterns. Just smudges darker than the surrounding fabric already beginning to soak in. He said they were too large to be from my mother's shoes. He said they were fresh. My mother closed her eyes, just for a second. When she opened them again, something in her expression had shifted. The last of her denial, whatever thin layer of it remained, had burned away. My father came back to the bedroom. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it, as if grounding himself. He told us someone had been inside the house. He said it plainly, without decoration. He told us we were safe now, but his voice lacked conviction. He called the police. I remember the wait more vividly than the arrival. The way time stretched and compressed. The way every sound outside the house made my muscles tense. I remember the distant wail of sirens growing louder, then fading, then returning, as if the sound itself couldn't decide where it belonged. When the police finally arrived, the house filled with unfamiliar presence. Flashlights cut through shadows. Voices echoed in rooms that had never held them before. The mud footprints were examined, measured, photographed. The officers asked questions my parents struggled to answer. Did you see the person? How long were they inside? Was anything taken? Nothing was missing. The doors were locked. The windows were intact. There was no clear point of entry. One officer suggested that perhaps the door hadn't latched properly. Another suggested it could have been a confused neighbor, someone intoxicated, someone who realized their mistake and left. No one said why a confused neighbor would test a bedroom door. No one explained the deliberate pacing, the dragging fingers against wood, the confidence in those movements. Eventually, the officers left. They promised follow-up. They suggested better locks, more lighting, vigilance. Their presence receded the way the intruders had, without closure. The house felt violated in a way I couldn't articulate then. Not broken into, not robbed, but crossed. A boundary had been tested and found thinner than we believed. That night, we didn't go to my grandparents' house. We didn't put out cookies. We didn't sleep properly. I lay awake listening to my parents whisper in the next room, the sound of their voices low and strained. Every creak of the house made my heart jump. Every gust of wind against the siding sounded like movement. At some point near dawn, exhaustion pulled me under. And when I woke up on Christmas morning, the world looked the same. The tree was still there. The light still worked. Presents sat neatly arranged beneath the branches. The house smelled like pine and cold air and something else beneath it, something that hadn't been there before. I opened my gifts like a child is supposed to, but something fundamental had shifted. Because I now knew, without being able to explain how, that Christmas Eve was not a night protected by tradition or belief or rules. It was just another night, and someone had walked through it without resistance. Brahme. Aftermath. In the years that followed, the adults in my life treated that night like an incident with edges that could be sanded down. Something unpleasant, yes, but contained. A stranger. A mistake. A door not fully latched. A coincidence made heavier by timing. They spoke about it less and less as time passed, as if silence itself could turn it into something harmless. As a child, I learned quickly that my fear was no longer welcome once the immediate danger had passed. The police never found anyone. No fingerprints that led anywhere. No matching reports in the neighborhood. No follow-up explanation that fit neatly. Eventually, the incident became a story my parents referenced only indirectly, usually when checking locks or reminding us to close windows. "After what happened that Christmas," my mother would say, and then trail off, assuming we all understood. We did, but not in the same way. For my sister, it faded. She grew older, busier, distracted by teenage life and then adulthood. When it came up years later, she described it as that weird night someone wandered into the house. Her memory focused on inconvenience and shock, not on the texture of fear. She slept through most of the police visit. She remembered the muddy carpet more than the footsteps. For me, it never softened. Christmas Eve stopped being a date and became a sensation. A pressure in my chest that arrived predictably every year as December wore on. Even as I grew, even as logic and vocabulary expanded, my body reacted first and refused to be convinced otherwise. I became sensitive to sound in a way that embarrassed me. I noticed footsteps outside my room. I memorized the rhythm of my parents' movements at night so I could tell when something didn't belong. At sleepovers, I never slept well. At relatives' houses, I insisted on keeping doors closed. When friends laughed at being scared of the dark, I laughed with them and hid how closely I listened to everything after the lights went out. Our family moved houses 2 years later. Not because of that night, at least that's what my parents said, but the timing never felt accidental to me. The new house was deeper into a development, farther from woods, brighter at night. My parents installed better locks, motion lights, an alarm system we never turned on during the day because it felt excessive. I still didn't feel safe on Christmas Eve. No matter where we lived, no matter how secure the house was supposed to be, the same pattern repeated itself. I slept lightly. I woke at every unfamiliar sound. I watched the clock tick toward midnight with the same tight anticipation I'd felt at 8 years old, except now there was no promise of gifts waiting on the other side. There was only the memory of a door opening quietly and footsteps that didn't rush. As I got older, I tried to force normalcy. I went to friends' parties. I drank when I was old enough. I stayed up late, surrounded by noise and people, hoping that if I crowded the night with enough activity, it wouldn't have room for whatever haunted it. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. Even in loud rooms, even with music and laughter, I'd find myself tracking exits, noting which doors were locked, which windows reflected darkness instead of light. I never told anyone the full story. Pieces, maybe. Enough to justify discomfort without revealing how deep it went. There was a shame attached to it that I couldn't articulate. Fear from childhood is supposed to be outgrown. When it isn't, people start asking questions you can't answer cleanly. What unsettled me most, as I grew older and replayed the memory with adult understanding, was not the presence of a stranger in our house. It was the manner of it. They hadn't rushed. They hadn't taken anything. They hadn't reacted to being interrupted. They had moved like someone exploring, not stealing. Like someone learning a space, testing its boundaries, feeling how far they could go before resistance appeared. The bedroom door had been the limit, not because it couldn't be forced, but because forcing it would have changed the nature of the visit. That distinction stayed with me. Years later, as an adult, I asked my parents about details they'd never volunteered. My mother admitted that the front door had definitely been locked. My father admitted that the mud prints didn't match any of our shoes and that the size suggested someone taller than him. Neither of them could explain how the person had entered or left without being seen. When I asked if they thought it could have been someone we knew, they exchanged a look I hadn't seen since that night. They said no. They said it felt intentional. We didn't talk about it after that. Now, as an adult, I live alone. I choose apartments carefully. I avoid ground floors. I install better locks than necessary. I don't leave curtains open at night. On Christmas Eve, I stay inside. I keep the lights on, not decorative lights, but harsh, functional ones. I don't rely on belief or tradition to protect me. I rely on awareness. I know that what happened to me could be explained away. A door mistake, a trespasser who got lucky, a coincidence amplified by timing and childhood fear. I've heard every version of that explanation, and on paper they make sense. But they don't account for how precise it felt. They don't account for the patience. They don't account for the fact that whoever walked through our house that night did so on Christmas Eve, a night when people are distracted, routines are altered, and homes are full, but also predictable. Most of all, they don't account for the way that night changed me permanently. Christmas Eve never returned to being a promise of warmth or magic or protection. It became a reminder that no night is special enough to stop someone from crossing a threshold if they decide to. That doors are symbols more than guarantees. That silence can be an action, not an absence. I still think about that person sometimes. Not what they looked like, not who they were, but where they went after they left. Because whatever they were looking for, they didn't find it in our house. And the idea that they simply moved on to another street, another home, another quiet night filled with lights and trust has stayed with me far longer than the fear ever did. All right, that's where I'm going to leave tonight's story. If you made it this far, thank you for listening, and I'd really like to hear what you think. Have you ever experienced something on Christmas Eve or as a kid that you still can't explain? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them, and I'm always looking for the next story to share. If you enjoyed this kind of slow, realistic, unsettling horror, subscribe to Mr.Spoocast and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next upload. It helps the channel more than you think. Stay safe, lock your doors, and I'll see you in the next one.